Among many ancient peoples, those early dawn hours are sometimes called the time of the two lights. It's that time when the sun is not yet up and doesn't rule the day, but the moon is set and it doesn't rule the night. It's a time when neither sun nor moon rules the universe. Everything is a time of shadows. In that fading darkness of night before the first hint of dawn breaks. Among the Celtic peoples of northwest Europe, they called it not the hour time between the two lights, but the twilight time. It was, they believed, the time when encounters between the two worlds of the living and the dead, of the spiritual and the everyday, could be felt and seen and experienced. Things that were out of reach to us when the sun was in the sky or the moon ruled the night. And the time between the two lights, we find ourselves in a dimension of time and space not available to us in our waking hours. It's in this time between the two lights that Mary and the other women creep in the darkness of the twilight between the two lights, creep silently to the tomb of Jesus. They're walking in emotional and probably physical shadows, stunned by what's happened, lost in their grief, filled with dark thoughts about what might happen next. They're betwixt and between Jesus' shocking torture and execution by imperial powers and what comes next. So, in this time, a time that Frederick Buechner doesn't call between the two lights, but between, he calls it the twilight darkness before resurrection. He says it's that time before resurrection when we can't be sure what we're seeing ahead of us, but we know for certain the curtain has fallen on everything that once was. And when the curtain goes up, it won't be the same scene we see. All of us know those kinds of moments in our lives, don't we? It's the time when the funeral's over and we go home to a space that feels no longer familiar, feels maybe now uncomfortable space. It's that time when the tests have given their diagnosis and the treatment or the surgery has begun. And once they're finished, we aren't sure what will be next for us. It may be that time when the nest is empty, but we feel like our son and daughter hasn't really left and they could come home in a moment, but we know they won't. This is the twilight darkness of resurrection. It's the time between the two lights. It's the time Mary and the other women are stumbling in the dark toward the tomb with their jars of spices and burial prayers. And they ask one another, who's going to move the stone? Who's going to roll away the stone? Let's not forget, the stone wasn't there to keep Jesus in. The stone was there to keep wild animals who were hungry out. Who's going to roll the stone away? And when those grieving women reach the tomb, they discover the stone's already been rolled away without them having to do anything. When they arrive, the tomb's already empty. They don't encounter a risen Jesus. Mark has no stories of the resurrection. In fact, Mark ends kind of abruptly in the middle of a sentence with the women leaving. There's no Mary in the garden meeting a gardener that she thinks is only a gardener. There's no Emmaus Road where the disciples fleeing Jerusalem meet a stranger on the highway. There's no coming through locked doors. There's no fire on the beach in Galilee. What Mark's women find, where Mark leaves the story, is only with an absence, an emptiness, in which they hear only a distant promise of something. The two shining figures at the tomb seem to suggest he's not here, he's risen, but where is he? And that's often our experience of the between times too, I think. What we usually find is a whispered promise of something somewhere on the edges of our knowing and loving in those moments when we're between times. I read recently we're going to have one of those rare years where the 13-year cycle of cicadas and the 17-year cycle of cicadas merge with one another. It's an interesting strategy by the cicadas, isn't it? You bury yourself for 13 or 17 years, practically a generation. So whatever's happened to the earth around you may be over by the time you finally hatch your next brood. But this summer, it's going to be a bad summer for cicadas. Be prepared to bring your earplugs at night. I grew up in central Illinois before air conditioning. And all night I could hear cicadas singing. At the height of their season, I would walk out in the yard or the garden and I'd see those shells of them in the grass. When I was a child, I thought those were the actual insect. But only looking more closely at it did I realize I was looking at an empty shell with these huge eyes and 6 claws. In her book, Walking in the Dark, Barbara Brown Taylor writes about growing up in the South, and she too would see cicada shells lying in the grass, something dead, lifeless. And then at night, before she fell asleep, she'd hear the cicadas singing in the trees outside her bedroom window. The slit in the back of that empty shell, she writes, was proof the cicada had escaped and left behind its empty shell while its song still echoed in the sky. That's Mark. The empty shell in the grass was proof of a living something, a presence to which the empty shell, the empty tomb, could only bear witness. I was walking a couple of weekends ago along the Norwalk Trail up near our home, and there's a lot of mud and debris beside the rail trail. Down in the water, I saw the skunk cabbage starting to stretch its green leaves up out of the mud toward the sun. Surrounding those green shoots was its spathe. The spathe of eastern skunk cabbage looks like a curved shell, sort of reddish purple with this mottled yellow-green spots on it. It was pulling away to let the green shoots come up. The skunk cabbage has to crack that shell of the spathe, crack it open so the inside can come out. And then everything is transformed, leaving the space behind to sink into the mud. I think that's the good news of Easter to those of us who felt the hard shell of our lives that we always thought would protect us. You know, we all create a personal shell around ourselves, physically sometimes, but certainly psychologically, and think it'll protect us from harm, from really being hurt. And then something happens that it unexpectedly cracks, comes apart under weight of some stone, some crisis we never wanted and never anticipated. And like those women, we ask, who will move the stone from us? This is almost more than I can bear. Who will move this pain off me? Who will roll away the stone that blocks the doorway back to the life I want? Would that it would happen as easily and naturally as it does for the cicada and the skunk cabbage. To us, resurrection comes instead, I think, like it did probably to Mary and the other women in Mark's gospel, as a whispered song of love sung by others around us, who communicate to us God's love in their simple presence and touch and look. Some of you know where our family is also living through Jan's niece, who their 2-year-old child is in a children's hospital in Atlanta, hooked up to a ventilator on a feeding tube, being pumped with antibiotics and everything else in tubes. And her husband her father's now taken a leave of absence from his job to be there. They are there 24 hours a day. What does resurrection look like in that kind of situation? Maybe it's the whispered song of love of their friends who've arranged for meals to be brought to them from an hour away, where all their friends live, to that hospital in the center of Atlanta, so they don't have to eat hospital food every day. And they sit there and they have conversation with them for a while every day, so they can think about something other than their baby lying in an ICU unit for children. Maybe that's what that distant song of resurrection sounds like. A couple of weeks ago, I wrote in one of those midweek reflections about these moving stones at Racetrack Playa in Death Valley. They seem to move all by themselves. Sometimes they're called sailing stones because they seem mysteriously overnight to float along, and you can see the track where they've left in the sand behind them in the morning. It turns out they float because there's an infinitesimal thin layer of moisture, which once it freezes in the desert night, begins then in the morning to crack. And that cracking moisture animates the space between the rock and the sand, so they begin to move along. It's the cracks that make them sail. Isn't that how our lives are? There comes a point where the stone just rolls away on its own, That's what Mary and the other women find that first Easter. They don't move it through their effort, it just is mysteriously changed, opened. There comes a point, often mysteriously in our lives, often surprisingly, when the stone weighing us down, the burdens crushing our lives, crack and move. And all we can do in such moments is receive the new chapter as it comes to us from beyond ourselves, and to be filled with the wonder that almost without realizing it, the old shell of our life has cracked, opened, and our lives are moving somewhere else, somewhere new, not of our doing. We use the word resurrect a lot. Scientists are trying to resurrect the woolly mammoth. Someone at Boeing is hoping a new leader will come to resurrect their business. We come to think often of resurrection as something we can do, something we can somehow manage or finesse, something we have to bring about by our own hard effort. But Easter Day, I think, comes to remind us that the stones in our life, the burdens that bear us down, do move. And it's not of our doing entirely. The resurrection God brought to Jesus and brings always to us is not our doing. Just as those friends that bring meals to our niece and her husband in Atlanta, it's not their doing, it's a gift. We give one another resurrection because of the love of God in our hearts. Compels us to love and support and care for one another. So as Psalm 118 chants that we started with at the beginning of our service, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. It's God's doing. And it is marvelous in our eyes when it happens. So be it. Amen.